Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and today I am joined, as always, by Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg. And if you've been paying attention this summer, if you've been joining us every couple weeks for our episodes, you know we've been going off the reservation, so to speak, and talking to other Reformed and Presbyterian denominations about what they've been up to in their general meetings, their summertime get-togethers and such. And we've been with the EPC and the ARP, and today we're jumping in with the RPCNA. So the Olympics is not the only place you can get a bunch of letters this year. You can get it here too, as we talk to this particular denomination. And none of the guys on the call with me are smiling at that joke. So I don't know if that was stupid or whatever. Maybe there's one of the things I'm going to take out later on. Anyway, we're here with Nathan Eshelman, and we're glad to have him. I'm going to ask him to introduce himself, tell us who he is, what he's up to, whatever he wants to share, and then we'll get into the world of the RP with him after that. Nathan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, guys. And, a little bit about myself. I'm an RPCNA minister. I'm currently serving in Orlando, Florida at Reformed Presbyterian Church that is downtown Orlando. I'm married, been married for just shy of a quarter century. I have 5 children. In the world of Presbyterianism, I have a podcast that I do with a couple of other friends called the Jerusalem Chamber. So you can listen to that if you want. Written a couple of books, written a book on worship, written a book on the Confession of Faith, the Westminster Confession of Faith. And just enjoy ministry, enjoy being part of the bigger Presbyterian world, interacting with other Reformed denominations as well. And so it's good to be here with you guys.
And Jerusalem Chamber goes through the Westminster Confession, right?
Yeah, it's a paragraph by paragraph discussion through the Westminster Confession of Faith. There's 4 ministers. We started in 2017 as 4 RPCNA ministers. We had one of our guys, Joel, who is now in the PCA in San Diego, California. So 3 RP guys and one PCA guy.
I feel like if that podcast had been made in the PCA, it would have been chapter by chapter. But yeah. I love y'all's style. It's great.
Yeah. So I think it is helpful to see that each paragraph is put together well. It's theologically rigorous, but it's also pastoral in nature. And that's what we wanted to capture in the podcast was, do some theological deep dive, but also show the pastoral implications of why we believe what we believe. So I think it's been, it's done what it was intended to do. None of us are like driving Bentleys or anything from it, but we have had good feedback. So
gotta get that Patreon going.
That's right.
Yeah.
Scott and Jared, it's a good idea. Maybe we should change to when we get back to the BCO later in the fall. We should go paragraph by paragraph instead of chapter by chapter. What you think? We probably would maintain our listenership, don't you think?
We would go from being finished in 3 years to being finished by the end of our ministry or something.
But as often as the BCO is updated, you may never finish as well.
Exactly.
It's purgatory. It's a sad purgatory.
You would just be on loop constantly. So
but the PCA's reputation precedes us.
Well, I mean, every Presbyterian does that. We tinker to some degree with things that are tinkerable. So we're all into that a bit.
Well, I'm going to let the other guys jump here in a second, but I'll give you something to start with, and then I'll let Scott and Jared kind of ping pong around some of these questions we have. Help us understand what is maybe, the world we live in. There's a bunch of different Reformed and Presbyterian denominations. What is unique about your denomination? What sets y'all apart? Historically speaking, theologically speaking, maybe in terms of polity, what are those distinctions that would be significant to help us understand the RPCNA?
Sure. Well, the RPCNA is one of the oldest denominations in the United States. We didn't break off from the mainline Presbyterian Church in the U.S. We're different than the OPC or the PCA in that regard, or any of those other ones that have left the mainline Presbyterian Church over issues. So our our division, so to speak, goes back to Scotland during the killing times. So 1680s in Scotland, and then there's the Glorious Revolution happens. William of Orange comes over and he tries to teach reform people in Scotland to play nice, and in that desire for the church to play nice, the the national church is put back together, and there's a group of people that stay out of that, who were called the Society people or Reformed Presbyterians, and so Reformed Presbyterians came to North America first as slaves. They were sent on slave ships, and eventually were able to come over and to try to do something uh, separate, with not being so close to England, and founding societies, which were basically like congregations without ruling elders or ministers. And eventually the church was established in the New World. First Presbytery meetings happening, good 50 years before the United States was established. And then eventually, soon after the United States was founded, there was a merger between the Reformed Presbyterians and the Associate Presbyterians, which was called the ARP. So you interviewed ARP recently, and so the ARP is that merger between Associate Presbyterians, who were the Seceders, Erskine Brothers, those sorts of things, and the Reformed Presbyterians. And the group that did not go into that merger were the Reformed Presbyterians. So there's a famous line from one of our church historians from the 1800s named William Melanchthon Glasgow. And William Melanchthon Glasgow, in his telling of this merger, he says, with the desire to make two churches one, they made three. So, there were APs that stayed out, RPs that stayed out, and then the ARP formed. So
Yeah, our church, which is now named New Life, but originally was named Raccoon Associate Reformed Church. It was part of the United Church that had come from that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So that's all part of that history. So that's sort of the part of our longer where we stand in the Presbyterian world. So we've kept out of some of those discussions, like we're not Machen's warrior children, and, we're not, part of the, Southern Presbyterian division that ended up becoming the PCA. Our history goes back further. So, the New World always had mainline Presbyterians, Associate Presbyterians, and Reformed Presbyterians sort of developing together. What makes us distinct, our historic majority distinction, is our doctrine of the mediatorial kingship of Christ, and related to our positions on political dissent and the role of government in having to submit to Jesus Christ as King of the nation. And that would be our historical distinctive, our distinctive now. People look at us and they would say, you're the psalm singing a cappella denomination. So there was a time when all Presbyterians sang a cappella psalms, and as that went away in other Presbyterian bodies, we sort of were the people left standing with the Psalter. So people, point at us and say, well, you're the psalm singing church. Well, that's true, but that's not why we existed historically. We existed historically on this doctrine of the mediatorial kingship of Christ, and in relationship to the nations of the world. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you also maintained during the time of the Civil War and before that. I don't know if it was following Samuel Rutherford, but a very anti-slavery stance,
Yeah.
which meant that a lot of the RP seemed to only be above the Mason-Dixon line for a while.
Yeah.
So I was surprised that you're below the Mason-Dixon line. Is there more RP churches in the
Yeah,
South now?
there's a few in the South. So you're right when it's really early on, early 1800s. If you were an RPCNA member, you couldn't own slaves, and there were whole congregations that packed up. The Carolinas were at one time the sort of the central place of RP life, and they packed up and they went to like southern Indiana, southern Illinois, just over the border, so to speak, and reestablished congregations there. And then after the Civil War, our first congregation was a mission to freedmen in Selma, Alabama. And there's a small congregation that still exists there, but we started a school for freed blacks in Selma and then eventually establishing a congregation there. And then the congregation that I serve was much later. So 1920 was when my congregation was established. There were RPs that were in Orlando in the late 1880s, early 1890s, but the congregation didn't actually get established until 1920. And then we have a few others in the South as well. Durham, in the Carolinas, we have one in Atlanta, an urban church in Atlanta, Mission Church, a church plant in Birmingham, Alabama. But for the most part, we're a Northern Presbyterian denomination with Scottish Presbyterian theology and roots. I think it's time for us to plant some churches in the South. I think that uh, some of those things that kept us out of the South in the 1800s, I think we can probably move past and get some churches planted down here again.
Yeah. Sorry to monopolize the time. I love the RP history. If you were to give somebody just like a book to read that would help them a little bit with some of the some of the history or things that are popular among them, I was told to read Fair Sunshine.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten to that yet, but I have it ordered. I think it's sitting in my mailbox right now, actually. But is there anything that would be good for us to pick up and read to get a little bit of a
Yeah,
familiarity with
there's
it?
yeah, there's a few different ones. J.G. Voss wrote a book called The Scottish Covenanters that is helpful. It's along the lines of Fair Sunshine. Um, that book was his THM thesis at Westminster Seminary originally. There's another book that sort of gives some of the social side of the RP church, but it also brings in some of the AP and ARP stuff. Is a book called Founding Sins, and that was that fight of the Covenanters against slavery in the New World, something that you mentioned. That's worth looking at as well. That was somebody's PhD dissertation. Um, there's recently in the last couple years, there's been published a rather fresh history of the RP Church by um, uh, Bill Edgar in Philadelphia, not Westminster Seminary Bill Edgar, but there's another Bill Edgar that's an RP minister in Philadelphia, and that's really helpful as well. Just sort of telling some of the stories and the theological discussions that were going on through the 1800s and then up until like 1980. So that's really been a good 2 volume as well.
Well, moving perhaps to your ecclesiastical work then. Where did y'all meet this summer, and what was some of the big ticket items that the RPs discussed at their synod?
Sure. Yeah, this year we met at Geneva College in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. That's actually our denominational college, and it's a college that goes back to the 1840s. I think it's 1848, if I remember its founding year correctly. But that's in Beaver Falls. It's in the hills of the Allegheny Mountains, just north of Pittsburgh. and we met there. We don't always meet there. We generally will meet in Indiana at a location that is rather inexpensive for us to all get to. But we were glad to be back in Geneva College. There were several big ticket items, as you called it. We had a number of appeals or complaints that came before the synod. One way that the RP Church does things differently than I believe the PCA does it is we hear our complaints and appeals as a whole body rather than that going to a commission that would make a decision on those complaints and appeals. And that's been something that's been rather important for us as a denomination because you really get the broadest representation when a complaint or an appeal comes before the synod. So a couple of those that came before us this year, we had a complaint against a presbytery by a man where he was essentially rebuked by his session for originally sending out an email to a portion of the congregation essentially saying that a man that was being put up by the session was disqualified and gave his reasons for that disqualification. And then he was rebuked. He was rebuked for that. And then he appealed that to his presbytery. The presbytery upheld what the decision of the session was, and then he appealed the presbytery's decision to synod, and that was debated, and a portion of that was upheld. So the essentially the man was confirmed in part in what his appeal was. We also had a minister who had run a website speaking against the position of the church on the content of the cup in communion. So the RP Church allows grape juice or wine or a combination thereof, which is probably what the PCA allows as well. And this website was arguing that it's sin to ever allow grape juice, and he was asked by his presbytery to take down or modify the website. He didn't want to do that, and they ended up disciplining him for that. He appealed that to synod, and synod upheld the presbytery's decision in that. So those were a couple. Go ahead.
With both of those, is that something of a trying to keep the debates about the church within the church courts? Is that kind of the theme of those two?
Yeah. So the first one with the email, it was sort of saying, there's an appropriate way to have these conversations, and they should come through the session. Like if you think a man's not qualified, you should discuss that with the session, and then respectfully, there's a way you can have that conversation more broadly. But sending out an email to a fourth of the congregation or a third or whatever it was, and saying, here's the reasons why you shouldn't vote for this man to be ruling elder. So it's a question of the appropriate relationship between those that are given the authority within the church and the congregation. And then the second one definitely has to do with, if you want something to change within the courts of the church or within the practice of the church, you go through the courts and you have that discussion with those that can actually change something, rather than just broadly saying, this denomination's in sin because, they're not doing things the way that, it should be done according to him. And, I think even people that have stronger views of whether it should be wine and communion found themselves siding with the presbytery as well, because of the way that that thing went about. There were some other big ticket items as well. uh, one relating to uh, the Reformed Presbyterian home. The Reformed Presbyterian home is uh, essentially a nursing home and an old folks home that we've maintained for many years. Originally, it was put together for ministers and missionaries that couldn't afford retirement years, and they would have a place to go and to stay. And there were two things against the home. One was there was a complaint against the home because this was a 2-year conversation that there was a former minister, retired minister living at the home. He'd fell behind on payments, couldn't afford to continue with those payments, and um, the home ended up suing this former minister for not paying his bill essentially. And his session where he was a member, they wrote a complaint against the RP home for suing a former minister. And then this was last year. They were asked to repent of that. Their letter of repentance was essentially like, we wish we wouldn't have had to do this, but you didn't pay your bill, so we had to do this, and that was the letter of apology. And then so that was that session brought that back to Synod and said, this is inappropriate. This is not what reconciliation looks like biblically. And then they were asked to actually reconcile with this former minister, and they sat through committees and then before the Synod, and they saw the error of their way, and they wrote a letter to the minister saying, we've sinned against you. And one of the board members actually flew to that to see that minister in person, face to face, sat with some from his session and his family, and apologized in person, and that worked out well. And then there was a second discussion related to the RP home. A nursing home is going to serve a variety of religious backgrounds. And one of those is that our home has a number of Roman Catholics that live in there. And it came to the attention of Synod that the Roman Catholic Mass was being said in our chapel. And there was a paper written to divest the RP home, to take away Synod funds going to the home until the Mass was no longer said in the home. And so there was a committee established to help the home work through what that is going to look like for them to not allow the Mass to be said in the chapel and still meet legal funding requirements for religious plurality or whatever it is our crazy government wants from them in that regard. So how can this still be distinctively a Reformed Presbyterian home where you're serving Roman Catholics, but at the same time not participating in their idolatries in allowing our chapel to be used for the Mass? So those were a couple big things. There's a bunch of other things. Maybe one that you would want to talk about. There was a paper that went forward for how Reformed Presbyterian ministers and officers, so elders, deacons, and ministers, how they would participate in worship in other faithful churches that do not sing psalms exclusively. So there was a minister last Synod, so 2023, where there was a complaint against a presbytery that ordained a minister whose father is a PCA pastor. And the question allegedly on the floor of presbytery was, if you're visiting your dad's church, are you going to sing hymns? And he didn't give an answer that at least one of the ministers in the presbytery found sufficient. I don't think he actually answered the question fully. It was sort of like, we'll see what happens when that comes, or it's complicated or something like that. And there was a complaint. And then from that complaint, there was a committee set up to talk about or to give counsel as to what what should we do when we're visiting the OPC or the PCA, and they sing hymns and it's against our conscience. So do we sing hymns and go against conscience and against vows, or do we not sing hymns and maybe offend the brethren there? Um, so there was this paper written, and then that ended up being discussed and debated, and then it was tabled indefinitely, which means that it just dies on the vine if it's tabled indefinitely, and it leaves us back where we were before that, where we just have to wrestle through our individual consciences as related to both our vows that say that worship is with psalms a cappella. As ministers, elders, and deacons are under a vow to say that we believe that and that we believe that practice is biblical. But we also have fraternal relationships with churches like you guys that are, that don't have the same practice as us, but we say, you are faithful brothers, and we have a good relationship with you guys, and the OPC and the URC, and we're one of the founding denominations of NAPARC, and so we have that relationship. We're not sectarian, but we just have a different conscience on that aspect of worship than your General Assembly does. So we're back at having to wrestle through what that looks like on an individual basis. And me as a minister, I've worshiped in a number of other NAPARC churches, and I'll stand quietly and reverently while a hymn is sung. I'm not going to sing it in worship, but I love when there is a psalm sung in other NAPARC churches, and happily participate in that as well. So sort of left back at trying to balance that out. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good reason to be Psalms inclusive in our churches.
Sure.
Give something for somebody that has that on their conscience that they're able to sing. I've noticed. I've had two different experiences that I thought were interesting. We had an RP person who joined our congregation to sing or to worship on a day when it was too snowy for him to get to his congregation.
Okay.
And I did notice that he was not singing. He would stand and he was respectful and would not sing the hymns until we got to a psalm that we were singing, and then he would sing. So you can see he was a lot happier when we got to one.
Yeah.
But I've had two experiences of being in a Free Church of Scotland and in an RP church. And what struck me at one point was when we were singing a psalm, and I looked around, and there's a few people that weren't even looking at their psalter. They just knew the words. And it's like,
Sure.
wow, when you know the songs that you're singing and their psalms, that's a benefit of that.
Yeah. I mean, many of our children have dozens and dozens of psalms memorized, and they're there in their hearts, and you'll have little kids just not using the songbook and robustly singing unto the glory of God. And it's great because they've put words in their heart that even on their deathbed they're going to recall and probably sing. So yeah.
Well, something else we had on there was just in thinking about where the RP is right now, two different categories: things that would be things that are encouraging that are going on right now in the RP, and things that may be challenges that your denomination is facing in the next few years even.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that there are several things that are encouragements. We've gotten through a few years that have been difficult. I think maybe the last 5 years have been difficult. There was a minister who wrote favorably towards human evolution, and that was dealt with in our courts, and he was rather popular and well known, and I think that affected us in causing some internal division as to what the best approach is for dealing with these sorts of things. And then the last few years, we even as a synod were dealing with an issue where there was a congregation that had a minor on minor sexual abuse scandal that
Mhm.
became rather national news, and that caused a lot of internal fighting within the presbytery, trying to best deal with that, and then that trickled up into the synod level as well, and I, it was very difficult because the clearly um, the dealing with minor on minor sexual abuse, nobody was favorable to that. Like, of course, everyone is against that, and that needs to be dealt with both legally as well as ecclesiastically. But the issue was that there was a relationship between the abuser and the pastor of the congregation. And the accusation was that the pastor had done some covering up of that abuse as a way to allegedly protect his own ministry and his reputation and those sorts of things. And that, um, we had been dealing with the effects of that. And there were a lot of judgments as far as the reasons why people thought the church should go this way versus that way, and that ended up with that congregation leaving the RPCNA and becoming an independent congregation. And we officially we dissolved the congregation, but they continued on as an independent church. um, the encouragement from that is that I think that maybe we're moving to the point where some of that is healing and able to deal with that. And I don't, maybe in the PCA that is something that is maybe beyond what your experience would be, because like I can't imagine that even no PCA minister knows all the other ministers, right? Like it's just not possible because of the larger, the big tent desire of the PCA, and that's fine. But in our context, we're about 100 congregations. We essentially know all the ministers in our denomination, and so when you're dealing with a case, sometimes the interpersonal stuff gets caught up in the middle of that rather than just looking at it from a standpoint of justice. The excuse me, the encouragement is I think we're getting to a place where some of those things are behind us and we're able to move forward. So that's one encouragement. Another encouragement is that this is me personally. I'm really satisfied with where uh, some of our institutions are. We have a denominational seminary. It's the fourth oldest seminary in the United States. Um, and there's just a lot of satisfaction with where they are as a seminary. So that's the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. And the
Yeah,
same
and
with, go
I'm
ahead.
just north of there, and we
Okay.
actually have had a few PCA people who have gone there, and we've actually been really impressed with the quality of the candidates that we've had that have come from RPTS lately. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's worth checking out, especially if you're in Western PA or
right,
near here and you don't want to travel,
right.
clear
Yeah,
across the country for something,
yeah,
and they'll take PCA people too.
right. And I did my MDiv at a different seminary, so I didn't go to RPTS for my MDiv. But I think that the quality of education is really good and it's affordable. Like guys aren't coming out of RPTS with, 10, 20, $30,000 debt like other reform seminaries. Won't name names, but you guys probably know ministers that have piles of debt that'll take them 20 years to pay off. Um, so a lot of satisfaction with RPTS, and then our denominational college too, Geneva College, which we mentioned. Geneva really wants to be a distinctively Reformed Presbyterian school that isn't trying to hide who they are. Geneva uh, teaches from the position of, we're a school that upholds the Westminster standards, and these are the things you're going to get. And your Bible classes are going to be confessional and biblical and rich. On the Lord's Day, the campus, like all the non-essential things are closed down. So you're not like the library is not open. They're not encouraging students to be studying on Sunday. They're encouraging them to get into good churches and go to worship. And the campus feels different on Sunday than it does on Friday. And that's really meaningful to me. I went to a Christian college. The Lord's Day, nobody cared about the Lord's Day. You'd have exams on Monday. Geneva is different, and I think that there's a lot of people that are happy with where Geneva is as well. Other things that are encouraging, there's always a little bit of church planting efforts going on in the RPCNA. We're encouraged by that. Steady growth and discipleship is encouraging. And then, there are challenging things. I think I've mentioned some of those things already in, working through some of those interpersonal things and how to handle situations after discipline has happened. The effects of people that move on to other churches. One of our congregations left us to go to the Free Church of Scotland Continuing. So our our denomination just hasn't had churches leave. I mentioned the Emmanuel congregation that left after that issue. And then this other congregation that went into the Free Church. Before that, it'd probably been 40 years since a congregation had left the RPCNA. So that's something that people have to work through and think through a little bit. What's the best way for churches not only to come, but if churches are going to leave, what's that look like as well? So those are a few of the challenges.
Anybody else want to jump in there and ask a question?
I mean, what surrounding ice cream happens at y'all's synod?
What surrounding ice cream?
Yeah, I mean, like, is there anything related to ice cream? Any social events or?
Yeah, so I think that the first night they do offer some ice cream, but there's other libacious activities that occur after synod as well. Where guys will get together and just enjoy some time in the evening and plan motions that will be made and decisions that may come up and reflect on things that went well or didn't go well, or make fun of some pastor for some motion that he tried to make and it failed tremendously, or so those things I think are the same no matter what church court you're in.
You've given me a whole new category. I've never thought to put ice cream socials in the libacious activity column,
well, I mean,
but now it is.
Yeah,
it is.
so
That's great.
How does one, maybe this is a late question, but who is invited to be a delegate at the synod?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. We, all of our teaching elders are able to go, and then for ruling elders, every congregation gets one ruling elder, and if their membership is over 100, they get two ruling elders. So every teaching elder is delegated automatically by his relationship to the presbytery, and then each congregation can send one ruling elder delegate and then another ruling elder delegate if they're over 100 members. So that's generally the makeup of the court. Will have more teaching elders than ruling elders, but we still have a good number of ruling elders that make a point to be there from year to year.
Scott, did you have a follow-up, or was that was it?
I mean, I could ask a follow-up. How large is your synod typically?
Yeah, so We
I could
this year
probably.
we had 150 delegates. So we have 100 congregations and we had 150 delegates. So that make up, I don't know the exact breakdown, but it's usually a few more teaching elders than ruling elders.
Scott's doing a spreadsheet of all of them, and at
Okay.
least in his
Yeah,
mind.
I'm cataloging them. I'm computing them.
All right.
We
Human
don't expect anybody
computations.
outside the PCA to understand the spreadsheet joke. If Scott spreadsheets everything.
Okay.
I don't. I'm trying to get away from it. I'm trying to expand my horizons.
I'm an Apple guy, so our on Apple, it's not Excel, it's called Numbers, but every time I open Numbers, it basically tells me that I need to update it. So it's
Like
not my day.
Michael Scott
it's not my day to
opening
day.
PowerPoint for the first time.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. All right, so we're gonna update it. That's gonna take about 5 or 7 minutes. All right. Well, guys, if you guys are good, I'm good. Nathan, is there anything else on your mind that you want to share that we didn't give you a way to share, or anything else?
I didn't come in with some big agenda. I just came in to chat with you guys. So
this is not the place to run an agenda. I'll tell you that.
Yeah,
Nobody
right?
would know. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I hope that your listeners learn something about the RPCNA and, would be, maybe interested in praying for us and the things we've talked about, but maybe visiting one if you're in the area too, and see what we look like. Sometimes I think our reputation is just that we're like really old fashioned and grumpy. And it's really not the case. I think most of our ministers are probably mid 40s and below, honestly. The grumpiness, my wife probably would say that I'm grumpy half the time, but I don't think that's the case either. I think we're a denomination that definitely takes our theology seriously. We take our worship seriously. We talked about that a little bit. But at the same time, I think that we're a very warm denomination, and there's a lot of young families and people that care about the things of God and love the Lord Jesus. And I think most PCA people would find that there's a lot of similarities that they enjoy.
There's been PCA churches I know that have benefited from your publishing company. I think it's Crown and Covenant.
Yep.
And I know churches that we have a Trinity Psalter hymnal that has a Psalter and hymnal in it. And I know other churches that have the full Trinity, and they also have the Psalter that your denomination has produced. And so they'll just say, hey, bring out the blue one or bring out the red one. And the blue one is the Psalter. So people should check that out too. I think there's more influence of the RP in the PCA than some people would suspect.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, as Covenanters everywhere would say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about anything that we've talked about, check out the show notes in your podcast player or at politymatters.org. Our big thanks to Nathan Eshelman for joining us. And if you've enjoyed the show, consider going online and listening to the Jerusalem Chamber. And you can go I'm going to find links for Nathan's books and stick those in the notes too. So y'all check him out and see what benefit you can glean from him. You can check out the show notes for all those details. You can go online to Twitter or Facebook and find us at Polity Matters. And be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast app of choice. If you have questions or comments, as always, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. And I think that's all we have for you today, listeners. So thanks again for spending time with us. And until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Goodbye.
Adios.
Goodbye.
Y'all take care.